The outlaws who barged into Solomon Reeves's workshop that sweltering July afternoon made two fatal miscalculations. The first was assuming a man without a right hand could never draw a gun with deadly speed. The second was believing that crafting intricate timepieces was all Solomon Reeves had ever done with his life before settling in Meridian Gulch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They couldn't have known about the 7 notches carved into the ivory grip of the Remington revolver hidden beneath his workbench, each one representing a name that no longer appeared on wanted posters throughout the Dakota Territory. They couldn't have known what the United States Marshals and 3 territorial governors knew, that the most feared manhunter west of the Mississippi wasn't some flamboyant young gun for hire, but a quiet, one-handed clockmaker who crafted the finest chronometers in Meridian County. Solomon Reeves woke before sunrise, just as he had every morning for the past 6 years. The phantom pain in his missing right hand greeted him like an unwanted visitor, familiar but never welcome. He massaged the scarred stump where his hand should have been, weathering the discomfort with quiet stoicism. Through the small window of his modest cabin, the first pale light of dawn illuminated his Spartan quarters. A single bed, a wooden chest for his few belongings, and a small table where a half-assembled pocket watch lay beside his tools. "Another day," he murmured to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. 6 years of solitude had made conversation feel like a foreign language, though the meticulous work of crafting and repairing timepieces suited his temperament. The precision required kept his mind focused, preventing it from wandering back to memories of gun smoke and blood. Solomon reached for the carved wooden prosthesis resting on his bedside table. Unlike the crude hooks many amputees wore, his replacement was an elegant mechanism of his own design, a testament to his skill as a craftsman. The prosthesis attached to the stump of his wrist with a system of leather straps and buckles, culminating in a smooth, polished wooden hand. It couldn't hold a gun, but it could stabilize a pocket watch while his left hand worked the delicate gears inside, a trade-off he'd willingly made when he abandoned his former life. After securing the prosthesis, Solomon dressed methodically. Worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the right sleeve carefully altered to accommodate his wooden hand, and a leather vest with pockets sized precisely for his watchmaking tools. He strapped his timepiece to his left wrist, a masterpiece of his craft, with complications that allowed him to measure intervals with extraordinary precision. Timing had always been his specialty in his former profession as much as his current. Solomon prepared a simple breakfast of strong coffee and cornbread left from the previous evening's meal. As he ate, he studied the order book on his table. Mrs. Holloway's grandfather clock needed cleaning. Judge Parker's pocket watch had a damaged escapement. 3 new railroad chronometers required final calibration before delivery to the Western Pacific Station Master. Ordinary work for an ordinary day. The distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted his planning. Solomon paused, cup halfway to his lips, his body instinctively tensing at the unexpected approach. Visitors to his workshop, situated a mile outside of Meridian Gulch, were rare, especially at this early hour. Most customers came to his shop in town, where he kept regular business hours 3 days a week. Moving to the window with the silent grace that had once been essential to his survival, Solomon observed 3 riders approaching along the narrow trail that led to his cabin. Their posture in the saddle told him immediately that these were not local ranchers or townspeople. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to long days in the saddle. Drifters, most likely, or perhaps cowboys between jobs. Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed how their coats hung open despite the morning chill, providing easy access to the revolvers holstered at their hips. Not unusual in these parts, but worth noting, By force of habit, his gaze swept the surrounding terrain, mapping lines of sight and potential cover should the situation deteriorate. Old habits, he muttered to himself, catching the instinctive assessment. It had been years since he'd needed to evaluate tactical positioning. Years since Solomon Reeves, the clockmaker, had allowed Solomon Timekeeper Reyes, the feared manhunter, to surface. Solomon stepped onto his porch as the riders approached, his face a careful mask of neutral politeness. The wooden hand remained, partially concealed by his position against the doorframe. Another old habit. No need to immediately reveal a potential vulnerability. "Morning, gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "You're a fair piece from the main road." The lead rider, a weathered man in his 40s with a thick mustache and calculating eyes, reined his horse to a stop at the edge of Solomon's property. His companions, younger men with the hard faces of those who'd seen too much too soon, flanked him slightly behind. "Morning," the leader replied, touching the brim of his hat. "This the Reeves place, the clockmaker?" Solomon inclined his head slightly. "It is. I'm Reeves." The leader dismounted with fluid grace, dropping his reins without concern for his horse. Wandering. A small detail that Solomon noted. The mount was well trained to ground tie, not a common skill for a casual rider's horse. "Name's Harlan Voss," the man said, approaching the porch with measured steps. "These are my associates, Quinn and Decker." The younger men remained mounted, their eyes continually scanning the property with poorly disguised interest. Another detail Solomon filed away. "What brings you to my door, Mr. Voss?" Solomon asked, making no move to invite the man onto the porch or into his home. "If you're looking for watch repairs, I keep a shop in town, open Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays." Voss stopped at the foot of the porch steps, hooking his thumbs casually in his belt, uncomfortably close to the revolver holstered at his hip. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, we're passing through to Montana territory, heard in town. You might have work. Skilled with our hands and not afraid of detail work. Thought you might need help with your chronometers, is it?" The hesitation before chronometers confirmed what Solomon already suspected. These men knew nothing about timepieces. Town gossip held that Solomon Reeves occasionally hired assistants when larger orders came in from the railroad, but he'd never actually done so. Someone had deliberately directed these men to his isolated cabin under false pretenses. "I work alone," Solomon replied evenly. "Always have. Whoever told you otherwise was mistaken." A flash of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed Voss's face before his affable mask slipped back into place. "That's so. Fellow in town, Johnson, I believe, at the saloon, seemed convinced you were looking to take on help with a big railroad contract." Solomon knew Walter Johnson well. The barkeep was one of the few people in Meridian Gulch he might call a friend. Johnson would never have sent strangers to his door without warning. "Mr. Johnson must have been confused," Solomon said calmly. "Or perhaps you misunderstood." The man called Quinn snickered, nudging his companion. "Didn't mention he was a cripple, did they, Decker?" Decker grinned, his gaze fixing on Solomon's wooden hand, now visible as he had shifted position. "No wonder. He needs help. Can't exactly set those tiny gears with a wooden paw, can he?" Solomon's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. He'd heard such comments before, whispers in town when people thought he couldn't hear, children mimicking his movements when they believed he wasn't looking. Usually, he let such remarks slide away without acknowledgement. Today, something about these strangers set his instincts humming like a taut wire. "My hand doesn't hinder my work," Solomon said, his voice taking on a cold precision that would have warned anyone who knew his past. "Nor does it affect my ability to handle unwelcome visitors." The subtle threat wasn't lost on Voss, whose eyes flickered briefly to Solomon's left hand, noting how it had drifted closer to his vest, where a man might conceal a derringer. "Boys," Voss said sharply. Mind your manners. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Mr. Reeves deserves respect. The rebuke seemed sincere, but Solomon had spent too many years reading men's intentions to be deceived. Voss's eyes held calculation, not sincerity. Since there's no work here, Solomon continued, I suggest you gentlemen continue on your way. Town's got a decent hotel if you need rest before heading north. Voss studied Solomon for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Appreciate the information. Sorry to have troubled you. He remounted his horse with the same fluid grace, then tipped his hat. Fine property you've got here, Mr. Reeves. Real fine. Something in the way he said it, like a man appraising merchandise he intended to purchase, sent a whisper of warning down Solomon's spine. Good day, gentlemen, Solomon said firmly, making it clear the conversation was over. As the riders turned to leave, Decker glanced back over his shoulder. Say, clockmaker, how'd you lose the hand anyway? Catch it in some gears? His companion laughed, but Voss silenced them with a look. Solomon didn't bother to answer. He watched silently as they rode away, waiting until they were specks on the horizon before turning back to his cabin. Inside, he moved directly to his workbench and lifted the false bottom of a drawer, revealing a well-oiled Remington Model 1875 revolver. The familiar weight of the gun in his left hand brought a flood of memories, some he'd spent years trying to forget, others he clung to as reminders of why he'd walked away. Solomon checked the action, though he knew the weapon was perfectly maintained. 7 brass cartridges lined up beside it, each one meticulously loaded by his own hand, despite his disability. Old habits died hard, especially those forged in blood and gun smoke. 6 years ago, when Solomon Reeves settled in Meridian Gulch, he'd buried his past, along with his real name. The townspeople knew him only as a former cavalry scout who'd lost his hand in a Comanche raid, a partial truth that served his purposes. None knew of his years with the U.S. Marshals, or of the 7 notorious outlaws he'd tracked and eliminated across the Dakota and Montana territories. No one knew that Solomon Reeves had once been Solomon Timekeeper Reyes, the most feared manhunter in the Western Territories, a man who could draw and fire with his left hand faster than most men could with their right, who could shoot a playing card in half at 30 paces, and who had brought 18 wanted men to justice, most of them in pine boxes. Solomon had left that life behind after a botched assignment had left a hostage dead, a young woman whose face still haunted his dreams. Though the official report had cleared him of wrongdoing, he couldn't forgive himself for failing to save her. He'd resigned his badge, changed his name slightly, and disappeared into the vastness of the frontier with only his revolver and the precision skills that would serve him well in his new profession. For 6 years, Solomon Reeves had been nothing more than a clockmaker with a missing hand and a talent for mechanical miniatures. The revolver hidden beneath his workbench had been fired only at wolves threatening nearby farms and deer for his dinner table. But as he watched the dust from the stranger's horses settle on the horizon, Solomon felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sixth sense for trouble brewing. Those men hadn't come looking for work. They'd come to scout his property, to assess its value and its vulnerabilities. Solomon returned the Remington to its hiding place, but get one cartridge out, rolling it between the fingers of his left hand as he considered his next move. If his instincts were correct, and they rarely failed him, Voss and his companions would return, and their intentions would not be friendly. The question now was whether Solomon Reeves, the one-handed clockmaker, could handle whatever came, or if Timekeeper Reyes would need to make an appearance after 6 years of retirement. Solomon stood in the doorway of his workshop in town, pocket watch in hand, comparing its steady tick against the tall regulator clock mounted on the wall. 3 days had passed since the unwelcome visitors had appeared at his cabin, and while they hadn't returned, their presence lingered in his thoughts, like gun smoke after a firefight. 2 seconds fast over 24 hours, he murmured, making a minute adjustment with a custom tool gripped between the fingers of his left hand. His prosthetic wooden right hand held the timepiece steady, serving as the perfect workbench for delicate operations. The small shop on Meridian Gulch's side street was a stark contrast to his isolated cabin. Here, dozens of clocks marked time. With synchronized precision, their combined ticking creating a soothing rhythm that most found maddening, but that Solomon experienced as perfect order. Glass cases displayed watches ranging from simple railroad timepieces to ornate creations with multiple complications, calendar functions, moon phases, and chronographs that could measure intervals down to a fifth of a second. Mr. Reeves, a tentative voice interrupted his concentration. Solomon looked up to see Catherine Tillman standing in the doorway, a leather-bound ledger clutched to her chest. At 26, she served as the town's telegraph operator and part-time bookkeeper. For several businesses, including Solomon's, her practical attire and wire-rimmed spectacles gave her a serious appearance that belied a sharp wit he'd come to appreciate during their professional interactions. "Miss Tillman," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I wasn't expecting you until Friday. The Western Pacific payroll comes through tomorrow," she explained, stepping into the shop. "I wanted to ensure your invoice for the chronometers was prepared correctly. The railroad doesn't tolerate administrative delays." Solomon gestured toward his small office at the back of the shop. "Please." As Catherine moved past the cases of timepieces, Solomon noticed her gaze lingering on his wooden hand. Unlike the pity or morbid curiosity he often encountered, her observation seemed more analytical. A familiar tension crept into his shoulders, the instinctive wariness of being studied too closely. 7 minutes, she said suddenly. "Solomon." He paused. "I beg your pardon. Your regulator clock," Catherine clarified, pointing to the master timepiece. "It's exactly 7 minutes ahead of the railroad standard time. I checked the telegraph time synchronization this morning." Solomon's eyebrows rose slightly. Few people would notice such a discrepancy. Fewer still would mention it directly. Most clocks in town run at least 15 minutes fast or slow. "You have a good eye for precision, Miss Tillman. Or perhaps you intentionally keep your regulator ahead by exactly 7 minutes, she responded with a hint of challenge in her voice. "The same way you always arrive at exactly 7:53 rather than 8 o'clock to open your shop." The observation struck uncomfortably close to habits Solomon had maintained for years, small behaviors designed to keep him from becoming predictable. Predictability got men like him killed in his former life. "I appreciate punctuality," replied evenly, withdrawing a folder of invoices from his desk. "The railroad chronometers are completed, 24 pieces, each regulated to within 2 seconds per day. The verification certificates are attached." Catherine accepted the folder, but her eyes remained on him with that same analytical intensity. "3 men were asking about you at the Frontier Saloon last night." Solomon's fingers stilled momentarily on the desk. "Oh?" "Rough-looking sorts. Their leader had a distinctive mustache, called himself Voss." "Did they now?" "It wasn't a question. They were particularly interested in your schedule, when you come to town, when you return to your cabin." Catherine adjusted her spectacles. Walter Johnson fed them false information, but they were persistent. Solomon met her gaze directly. "And why are you telling me this, Miss Tillman?" "Because Walter also mentioned that these men spent considerable time conversing with Randall Morris." The name landed like a lead weight. Randall Morris, the wealthiest man in Meridian County and owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory. Also the man who had been pressuring smaller ranchers to sell out for the past year, sometimes through questionable means. "I see," Solomon said quietly. "There's more," Catherine continued, her voice lowering. I was processing telegrams. Yesterday when one came through for Morris, from Helena, it mentioned a specialist arriving to handle the Reeves situation if preliminary efforts failed. Solomon's expression remained neutral, though his mind was already calculating implications and contingencies. You opened a private telegram? Flush-colored Catherine's cheeks. The message came through garbled. I had to request a repeat transmission. It happens occasionally. Of course, Solomon replied, though the slight curve of his lips suggested he didn't believe her explanation for a moment. Your concern is noted, Miss Tillman, but I'm simply a clockmaker. What situation could possibly require a specialist? Catherine closed the ledger with a sharp snap. Mr. Reeves, I've lived in Meridian Gulch my entire life. I've watched Randall Morris systematically acquire every property that stands in the way of his empire. When owners refuse to sell, misfortunes tend to follow. And you believe I'm next on his list? Your property sits atop the only reliable. Year-round spring between Morris's north and south ranges. He's tried to buy it 3 times in the past year. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Don't pretend you don't know what's happening, Solomon conceded with a slight nod. What would you have me do, Miss Tillman? Sell my home to avoid trouble? I would have you be careful, she replied firmly. And perhaps consider that in Meridian Gulch, you have more allies than you think. After Catherine left, Solomon locked the shop door early, hanging the closed sign, despite scheduled hours lasting another 2 hours. Her warning had crystallized suspicions already forming in his mind. If Morris was behind Voss's visit, matters were more serious than he'd initially assessed. The walk to Sheriff Taylor's office took less than 2 minutes. The lawman was exactly where Solomon expected, feet propped on his desk, hat tipped forward, apparently dozing, but actually observing the street through the window's reflection. Afternoon, Sheriff, Solomon greeted him, closing the door softly behind him. Taylor, a man in his 50s with iron-grey hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the harsh Dakota sun, straightened in his chair. Reeves, rare to see you making social calls. This isn't social, Solomon replied, taking a seat without invitation. What do you know about 3 riders who came through town recently? Leader calls himself Harlan Voss. Taylor's expression didn't change, but Solomon noticed the subtle shift in his posture. The lawman was suddenly fully alert. Why do you ask? They paid me a visit, claimed they were looking for work, lied about who sent them. Taylor sighed, opening a drawer to withdraw a folded telegram. I was hoping they'd pass through without causing trouble. He handed the paper to Solomon. Received this from the sheriff in Bismarck 2 days ago. Seems your visitors have quite a reputation. Solomon unfolded the telegram, scanning its terse contents with practiced efficiency. Voss gang, suspected in 3 ranch arsons and 2 murders in North Dakota Territory. Witnesses intimidated. No. Formal charges filed. Hired muscle, Taylor said flatly. They specialize in convincing reluctant property owners to sell, work mostly for cattle operations and railroad interests. Solomon refolded the telegram. And you didn't think to warn me? I sent Deputy Hayes out to your place yesterday. Taylor countered. You weren't there. Figured I'd catch you next time you were in town. He studied Solomon with shrewd eyes. Though I'm curious why they'd target you specifically. Your little clock shop doesn't seem like the type of business they'd bother with. It's not the shop, Solomon replied. It's my land. Understanding dawned on Taylor's face. The Cottonwood Spring property. Morris has been after that water source. For years, Solomon nodded. Catherine Tillman mentioned a telegram about bringing in a specialist if the preliminary approach failed. Taylor's expression darkened. That suggests Morris expected you might resist Voss and his boys. He leaned forward. What are you not telling me, Reeves? Most folks would be intimidated by men like the Voss gang showing up at their door. You don't seem concerned. Cautious, Yes, but not afraid. Solomon met the sheriff's gaze steadily. I've encountered their type before. Have you now? Taylor's tone was carefully neutral. In your clockmaking days? Before that. A charged silence filled the office. For 6 years, Sheriff Taylor had respected Solomon's privacy, never pushing for details about his past beyond what Solomon had volunteered upon arrival. Now, the older man seemed to be weighing whether that courtesy had reached its limit. I've been sheriff here going on 17 years, Taylor finally said. Seen all sorts come and go. Most people running from something eventually bring their troubles with them. He tapped a finger thoughtfully on his desk. But you, Reeves, you've been different. Kept to yourself, caused no problems, contributed to the community in your way. Never once got the sense you were bringing trouble, more like you were leaving it behind. Solomon remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. Here's my concern, Taylor continued. Morris has money and influence. If he's hired Voss, he's playing a dangerous game, but still within certain boundaries. A specialist, though. He shook his head grimly. That suggests someone with skills beyond simple intimidation, someone sent to eliminate a problem permanently. You think Morris would risk murder? Solomon asked, though he already knew the answer. Not directly. He'd maintain plausible deniability. Tragic accident. Robbery gone wrong. Something that wouldn't trace back to him. Taylor's eyes narrowed. My advice: sell the property and move on. Solomon stood, adjusting his wooden hand with his left. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. That's not an answer, Reeves. No, Solomon agreed. It isn't. As he turned to leave, Taylor spoke again, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. One more thing. Whatever you're planning, don't. My jurisdiction, my responsibility. Let me handle Morris and his hired guns. Solomon paused at the door. And if they come to my property again, you defend yourself as needed and send for me immediately. Taylor's gaze was unwavering. But if I find out you went looking for trouble, we'll have problems. Clear? Perfectly, Solomon replied, though both men recognized the deliberate ambiguity in his tone. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down Meridian Gulch's main street. Solomon paused, observing the familiar tableau of the frontier town he'd called home for 6 years. Buckboards and saddle horses lined the hitching rails. The frontier saloon was beginning to fill with ranchers and cowhands coming in for evening recreation. The general store was doing brisk business with homesteaders stocking up on supplies. His gaze settled on the Western Union office, where Catherine Tillman would be finishing her day's work. Her warning had been unexpected, not just the information, but her willingness to involve herself in what could become a dangerous situation. In 6 years, Solomon had maintained a careful distance from everyone in Meridian Gulch, forming no connections that couldn't be severed at a moment's notice. Yet here was this telegraph operator deliberately intercepting private messages and bringing him information at potential risk to herself. It was inconvenient. Complications he didn't need if matters with Morris and Voss escalated. Solomon turned toward the livery stable where he kept a horse for trips between town and his cabin. The stable boy, Jamie, was mucking out stalls when Solomon entered. Evening, Mr. Reeves, the 14-year-old called cheerfully. Want me to saddle Kronos for you? No need, Solomon replied, reaching for his saddle himself. I can manage. Jamie watched with ill-disguised fascination as Solomon efficiently saddled the dun gelding despite his wooden hand. Most people tried to hide their curiosity about how he compensated for his disability. The boy's open interest was almost refreshing. Mr. Reeves, Jamie said suddenly, those men who were asking about you yesterday, they came back this afternoon. Solomon's hands paused on the cinch. Did they? Now, yes, sir. But they weren't asking about you this time. They were meeting with someone. Who? "Don't know his name," Jamie replied. Stranger. Arrived on the afternoon stage from Helena. Fancy dresser with a long coat even in this heat. Had a strange-looking pistol, not a revolver, more like those European dueling pistols, but smaller. A derringer, Solomon thought, favored weapon of gamblers and assassins. The man from Helena, Solomon asked carefully, did he have a scar? Here? He traced a line across his left eyebrow. Jamie's eyes widened. Yes, sir. You know him? We've never met, Solomon replied truthfully, but I know of him. If the description matched who Solomon suspected, Morris had indeed escalated matters considerably. Lucas Thorne was no common gunman. He was a contract killer who specialized in making murder appear accidental or self-defense. A man who had eluded lawmen across 5 territories, leaving at least 12 bodies in his wake. A man whose method of operation Solomon knew intimately because he had once been assigned to track him down. An assignment interrupted by the hostage situation that ended his career. Jamie, Solomon said quietly, could you deliver a message to Miss Tillman at the telegraph office? Tell her I received her package and will be indisposed for the next few days. My shop will remain closed until further notice. Yes, sir, Jamie replied eagerly. Anything else? Solomon considered, then added, tell Sheriff Taylor the specialist has arrived. He'll understand. As Jamie ran off with the messages, Solomon finished saddling Kronos and led him out the back way, avoiding Main Street. The pieces were falling into place with a dreadful familiarity. Morris had sent Voss and his men as the first approach, intimidation, perhaps arson if necessary. When that failed, he'd summoned Thorne, a man who left no loose ends and no witnesses. Under normal circumstances, Solomon would have packed his few important possessions and disappeared before dawn. His expertise in disappearing had kept him alive in his former profession and had allowed him to establish his new identity here. Walking away was the logical choice. But as he mounted Kronos and turned toward the trail leading to his cabin, Solomon knew he wouldn't be leaving. Not this time. For 6 years he had deliberately avoided conflict, submerging the man he had been beneath the quiet craftsman he had become. 6 years of looking away when powerful men like Morris bullied and threatened those weaker than themselves. 6 years of pretending that Solomon Timekeeper Reyes was dead and buried. As the sun descended toward the horizon, casting his shadow long across the trail ahead, Solomon made his decision. He wouldn't run from Lucas Thorne. Instead, for the first time in 6 years, he would prepare to meet an adversary on his own terms, with precision, timing, and, if necessary, lethal force. The timekeeper was about to emerge from retirement, and Lucas Thorne was about to discover why Solomon had earned that name long before he ever crafted his first chronometer. Solomon sat motionless in the darkness of his cabin, listening to the night sounds outside. The chorus of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustling of cottonwood leaves in the breeze. But his attention was focused on detecting any disruption to this natural symphony, any indication that men were approaching his property under cover of darkness. The cabin was dark, save for a single lantern burning low on the table, casting long shadows across the room's interior. To anyone watching from outside, it would appear that the clockmaker had retired early, perhaps reading by lamplight before sleep, a predictable routine for a predictable man. But the Solomon Reeves of 6 years ago would never have been so predictable. He had spent the hours since returning from town preparing for what might come. The Remington revolver now sat cleaned and loaded on the table before him, alongside a small case containing the specialized tools of a trade he had abandoned years ago. From a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard, he had retrieved items that Solomon Reeves, clockmaker, had no business possessing: a telescopic sight that could be mounted on a rifle, several small vials of chemicals, specialized ammunition, and a worn leather-bound notebook containing diagrams, distances, and notations. In a cipher of his own creation. Most tellingly, he had removed the wooden hand that had become his public identity. In its place, he had attached something few knew existed, a mechanical prosthesis far more sophisticated than his everyday wooden appendage. This device, crafted during long winter nights when memories kept him from sleep, featured articulated, metal fingers controlled by subtle movements of his forearm muscles. It couldn't match the dexterity of a natural hand, but it had been designed with one specific purpose in mind, to stabilize a revolver while his left hand cocked and fired. A tool created for a contingency he had prayed would never arise. The soft scrape of boot leather against stone, nearly imperceptible but unmistakable to trained ears, broke the natural rhythm of night sounds. Solomon remained motionless, only his eyes shifting toward the direction of the noise. The approach was from the west, using the shadow of the cottonwood grove for cover, a professional's choice, avoiding the open ground around the cabin. A second noise, this time from the opposite direction, the gentle creak of saddle leather as someone dismounted. They were coordinating a two-directional approach, standard procedure for professionals expecting resistance. Solomon extinguished the lantern with a quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. His eyes, already adjusted to the dim light, could make out the shapes of furniture and doorways. More importantly, the thin shafts of moonlight penetrating through small gaps in the window coverings provided just enough illumination to create navigational markers. He moved silently to a predetermined position behind the large oak cabinet that held his clockmaking tools, a space just wide enough for a man to stand unseen from both the door and windows. In the darkness, he removed a small object from his vest pocket, a modified pocket watch. But instead of telling time, this device served a very different purpose. At precisely midnight, a time he knew because his internal clock, honed by years of precision timing, never failed him, Solomon pressed the stem of the watch. A series of small mechanical clicks emanated from various points around the cabin's exterior, so faint they would be indistinguishable from insect sounds to the untrained ear. What followed was silence. A sudden, complete absence of movement. Outside, the intruders had heard something, perhaps felt the subtle change in atmosphere that accompanied activated mechanisms, and frozen in place, uncertain. 10 seconds passed, 20. Then the cautious advance resumed, now with heightened wariness. Solomon allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Phase 1 complete. The perimeter alerts had functioned as designed, and more importantly, had put the intruders on edge. Men who were nervous made mistakes. Men who were nervous and trying to maintain stealth made even more. Through the window, to his right, Solomon caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving toward the front door. The man's outline was bulky, suggesting Decker or Quinn from Voss's gang. No sign yet of Lucas Thorne. The specialist would be hanging back, watching, evaluating, looking for signs of preparation or ambush. It was what Solomon himself would have done in a similar situation. A soft metallic scrape at the door lock confirmed they were attempting entry. Solomon remained motionless, counting silently in his head. In precisely 12 seconds, the lock would yield to their picking tools. 5 seconds after that, the door would open, and the first man would enter, staying low, weapon drawn. At the 10-second mark, Solomon gently depressed a small lever concealed in the floorboard with his boot heel. The lock clicked open on schedule. The door began to swing inward. As predicted, a figure entered in a crouch, the moonlight glinting off the barrel of a revolver in his hand. "It's clear," the intruder whispered hoarsely. "Looks like he's—" His words ended abruptly as the tripwire Solomon had activated caught the man at ankle height. It wasn't designed to injure, merely to unbalance, which it did with perfect precision. The intruder pitched forward, instinctively throwing out his hands to break his fall. In the same instant, Solomon emerged from his hiding place, moving, with the fluid grace of a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario repeatedly. The Remington revolver in his left hand spoke once, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck not the fallen intruder, but the oil lamp hanging directly above him. Glass shattered, kerosene sprayed, and the second intruder, now silhouetted in the doorway, became a perfect target against the night sky behind him. Solomon's second shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him backward out of the cabin with a cry of pain. "Quinn's hit," the fallen man shouted, scrambling to regain his footing in the darkness. "It's a trap." Solomon was already moving to his secondary position, diving behind the heavy oak table he had strategically repositioned earlier that evening. The fallen lamp had ignited a small, controlled fire, precisely where Solomon had intended, illuminating the doorway while leaving his position in shadow. A barrage of gunfire erupted from outside, bullets splintering the cabin walls and shattering the remaining windows. Solomon remained motionless, counting shots. 3 revolvers firing, Voss and his 2 men accounted for, but no precise single shots from a derringer. Thorne was still, holding back, observing. When the initial fusillade ended, Solomon called out in a voice pitched to carry, "You're trespassing on private property, gentlemen. The sheriff has been notified. I suggest you collect your wounded and leave while you still can." "You shot my brother, you one-handed freak," came the enraged reply. Decker's voice, confirming Quinn was the man Solomon had wounded. "He'll live," Solomon replied calmly. "The bullet passed clean through his shoulder, but the next one goes through something more vital if you don't withdraw immediately." A cold laugh came from the darkness beyond the doorway, not Decker or the fallen man inside, but a new voice. "Voss." "Mighty confident for a clockmaker," Voss called. "Though I'm starting to think there's more to you than tiny gears and springs. Reeves, or should I call you by another name?" The question sent a chill through Solomon. Did they know his real identity? Had Thorne somehow recognized him from his former life? "The only name that matters is Randall Morris," Solomon replied, shifting focus. "The man who sent you to intimidate me off my land." "Business is business," Voss answered with a shrug in his voice. "Nothing personal, but you've complicated matters by putting a bullet in Quinn. That makes it personal for Decker here." "Then I suggest Mr. Morris compensate you appropriately for your troubles," Solomon countered, "because you won't be getting my land. Not tonight, not ever." During this exchange, Solomon had been calculating angles and distances in his head. The fallen intruder inside the cabin had used the distraction to crawl behind a storage chest, his revolver now trained in Solomon's general direction, though the man couldn't quite see him in the shadows. The fire from the broken lamp was spreading, not dangerously yet, but enough to gradually illuminate more of the cabin's interior. Solomon had perhaps 2 minutes before his position would be exposed. "I admire your spirit, Reeves," Voss called, his voice taking on a more menacing tone. "But you're outmatched. 1 man with 1 hand against 4 experienced gunmen. The odds don't favor you." Solomon's response was not in words, but action. In one fluid motion, he raised the Remington and fired twice in rapid succession. The first bullet struck the fallen lamp's metal base, sending it skittering across the floor directly toward the hidden intruder. The second shot hit the chest. The man was hiding behind, splintering wood mere inches from his head. The intruder broke, scrambling toward the door in panic, firing wildly as he went. Solomon let him go. 1 less threat inside was 1 less angle to cover. 3 gunmen now, Solomon corrected calmly. "And you seem to be laboring under a misapprehension about my missing hand being a disadvantage." As if to emphasize his point, Solomon used his mechanical prosthesis to withdraw a small object from his vest, a compact mirror attached to a telescoping rod. With practiced ease, he extended the rod and positioned the mirror to provide a view of the area outside the shattered window while remaining in cover. The reflection showed Voss and Decker crouched behind the water trough, with Quinn lying behind them, clutching his bleeding shoulder. But more concerning was what he didn't see. No sign of Lucas Thorne. The specialist had either remained at an extreme distance, or more likely, was circling to find another angle of attack. Solomon knew he needed to change the dynamics of this confrontation quickly. The fire was spreading, and while he had planned for this possibility, positioning his most valuable possessions and documents in a metal chest that could withstand the flames, the growing blaze would soon force movement. "Last warning, Voss," Solomon called out. "Take your men and leave. Tell Morris that his specialist won't fare any better than you have." A momentary silence followed, then Voss's voice came back, tinged with genuine surprise. "You know about Thorne?" "I know more than you think," Solomon replied. "I know he's killed 12 men across 5 territories. I know he prefers a twin-barrel Derringer with custom-made ammunition. And I know he's not out there with you right now, which means he's trying to circle behind me." The silence that followed told Solomon his assessment had hit home. Voss had not expected this level of knowledge from a supposed clockmaker. Solomon used the momentary advantage to implement the next phase of his plan. With quick, efficient movements, he reached up to the ceiling beam above him and retrieved a small cloth pouch he had positioned there earlier. Opening it revealed several small glass vials and a mechanical contraption that resembled a miniature clockwork mechanism. "What Morris didn't tell you," Solomon continued, working with his left hand while he spoke, "is that I specialized in precision, timing long before I started making clocks." He attached the mechanism to one of the vials and set it on the floor, then began a deliberate movement toward the rear wall of the cabin where a concealed exit awaited, a modification he had made. Years ago, out of old habits he couldn't break. "In approximately 30 seconds, Solomon said, his voice still carrying the same calm precision, "a mixture of chemicals will create a reaction that produces a thick, acrid smoke. Not harmful, but extremely disorienting. It will pour out these broken windows and provide excellent cover. For me, not for you, since I know exactly when and where it will deploy." "He's bluffing," Decker growled outside. "Maybe," Voss replied, though doubt had crept into his voice. "Either way, he can't escape a burning cabin without exposing himself." Solomon had reached the rear wall now, where a section of apparently solid logs could be pivoted outward to create an opening just large enough for a man to squeeze through. As he prepared to make his exit, the mechanism he had set in motion clicked into action. The vial cracked, chemicals mixed, and within seconds a dense white smoke began billowing through the cabin, pouring out the broken windows toward Voss. And his men, coughing and cursing, erupted outside as the smoke enveloped their position. Solomon slipped through his escape hatch, emerging into the cool night air on the opposite side of the cabin from where Voss and his men were positioned. But as he straightened, instinct made him drop immediately back to a crouch. The whisper of disturbed air was his only warning as a bullet passed through the space where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. "Impressive escape route, timekeeper," came a soft, cultured voice from the darkness to his left. "Though I expected nothing less from the man who nearly caught me in Bismarck 6 years ago, Lucas Thorne." And he knew exactly who Solomon was. "You have the advantage on me, Mr. Thorne," Solomon replied, keeping his voice steady while his eyes searched the darkness for any sign of the assassin's position. "I don't recall us being formally introduced." A low chuckle emanated from the shadows. "We weren't, but I make it my business to know who's hunting me. You were quite the topic of conversation among my kind, the one-handed marshal who never missed a shot, until that unfortunate business with the banker's daughter, of course." The mention of the hostage situation that had ended his career sent a spike of cold anger through Solomon's chest. You seem well informed for someone who's spent his life running. Professional courtesy, Thorne replied, though I admit I never expected to find you here playing at being a clockmaker. Does Morris know who he's actually targeted? Unlikely, Solomon said, gradually shifting position as he spoke, trying to pinpoint Thorne's location by sound. He's just a greedy rancher who wants my water rights. Pity. Thorne's voice seemed to come from a slightly different direction now. He was moving too, circling like a predator. When he hired me to eliminate a troublesome clockmaker, I had no idea I'd be facing the legendary timekeeper. It adds a certain professional satisfaction to the assignment. Solomon's prosthetic hand moved slightly, adjusting the grip on his Remington. I'm retired, Thorne, have been for 6 years. Yet here you stand, gun in hand, having just outmaneuvered 3 hired guns. Old habits, timekeeper. A subtle metallic, a click. The sound of a derringer's hammer being pulled back came from approximately 15 feet to Solomon's right, behind the woodpile. In that instant, Solomon calculated trajectory, angle, and timing, just as he had done countless times in his former life. The Remington in his left hand swung up and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet struck not Thorne, but the woodpile itself, sending splinters and logs cascading in the direction of the sound. The distraction was minimal, but for an operation measured in fractions of seconds, it was enough. Solomon lunged sideways as Thorne's derringer discharged, the bullet grazing his left shoulder instead of finding his heart. Solomon's second shot followed immediately, guided more by instinct and muscle memory than visual targeting. A sharp intake of breath from the darkness told him the bullet had found some mark, though likely not a fatal one. First blood to you, timekeeper, Thorne acknowledged, his voice now tight with pain. It's been years since anyone managed that. Solomon didn't respond, instead using the momentary advantage to change position again, moving toward the corner of the cabin where the growing firelight wouldn't silhouette him. Your reputation wasn't exaggerated, Thorne continued, also moving. The subtle sounds of his passage barely perceptible even to Solomon's trained ears. But I wonder, have 6 years of crafting trinkets dulled your edge? The Solomon Reyes I studied would have made that shot count. Perhaps, Solomon conceded, reloading the spent chambers in his Remington with practiced efficiency, despite using only one hand and his prosthesis. Or perhaps I'm not aiming to kill you, Thorne. A skeptical laugh answered him. Noble sentiment, but we both know better. In our profession, it's kill or be killed. I left that profession behind. Did you? Thorne's voice carried genuine curiosity. Now, the elaborate preparations suggest otherwise. The traps, the escape route, the smoke device, these aren't the improvisations of a clockmaker defending his home. They're the calculated contingencies of a manhunter expecting trouble. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Solomon had indeed prepared his cabin for this possibility from the day he purchased it, adding defensible features and escape options that no ordinary citizen would consider necessary. Even as he embraced his new identity, some part of him had never fully believed he could escape his past. Old habits, Solomon acknowledged, echoing Thorne's earlier observation. Indeed, which makes me wonder why a man with your skills would hide in this backwater, making watches and repairing grandfather clocks when you could have written your own ticket with any number of employers who value such talents. Because I've seen where that path leads, Solomon replied genuinely now, to men like you, Thorne, men who sell their skills to the highest bidder with no regard for justice or innocent lives. The cabin's roof was fully engulfed in flames now, illuminating the yard in flickering orange light that created shifting shadows, perfect concealment for 2 men engaged in a lethal game of cat and mouse. Justice, Thorne sounded amused. Was it justice when you put a bullet through Harlan Day in Deadwood, or when you tracked the Jessup brothers for 3 weeks before gunning them down at their camp? Your badge didn't make you different from me, timekeeper. It just made you sanctioned. Solomon remained silent, unwilling to engage in the moral equivalence Thorn was attempting to draw. Instead, he focused on the tactical situation. Voss and his remaining men had fallen suspiciously quiet on the other side of the burning cabin. Either they had retreated in the face of the fire and smoke, or they were repositioning for another assault. The sound of approaching hoofbeats added a new complication. Riders coming fast from the direction of town. Sheriff Taylor perhaps responding to the gunfire and visible flames, or reinforcements sent by Morris. "It seems our private duel is about to be interrupted," Thorn observed, having also heard the approaching riders. "A pity. I was enjoying this reunion." "Surrender now, Thorn," Solomon called. "Face justice for the lives you've taken." Another low laugh answered him. "Another time, perhaps, timekeeper. Morris isn't paying me enough to face both you and the local law. But don't worry, our business remains unfinished. I never leave a contract incomplete." Before Solomon could respond, a series of rapid gunshots erupted from the far side of the cabin, Voss and his men providing covering fire as Thorn made his escape. Solomon caught a glimpse of movement as a figure darted toward the cottonwood grove where horses would be tethered. He raised his Remington, tracking the movement, finger tightening on the trigger. For a heartbeat, he had Thorn squarely in his sights. A killing shot at a range well within his capabilities, even in the uncertain light. But he hesitated. 6 years ago, Solomon Timekeeper Reyes would have taken that shot without a second. Thought, ending Lucas Thorn's murderous career with a single bullet. But the man who raised the Remington now was caught between two identities, the relentless manhunter he had been and the clockmaker he had become, a man who understood all too well the weight of taking a life. In that moment of hesitation, Thorn vanished into the shadows of the grove. The approaching riders crested the hill, Sheriff Taylor at the lead, followed by his deputy and several armed townsmen. They drew up short at the sight of the burning cabin and Solomon standing in the yard, Remington still raised toward the cottonwood grove. "Reeves!" Taylor called, dismounting quickly. "What in God's name happened here?" Solomon lowered his weapon, slowly, watching as Voss and his remaining men fled in the opposite direction, taking advantage of the diversion. They would be long gone before Taylor could organize a pursuit. "Morris sent men to drive me off my land," Solomon replied simply, holstering the Remington. "They set fire to my cabin when I refused to leave." Taylor's gaze moved from the burning structure to Solomon's face, then to the mechanical prosthesis that had replaced his familiar wooden hand. His eyes narrowed with the look of a man seeing puzzle pieces fall into place. "Just like that?" the sheriff asked skeptically. 4 against 1, and you're standing here without a scratch while they're running for the hills." "I got lucky," Solomon replied, the same answer he had given to similar questions for years. Taylor dismounted, approaching Solomon with a measuring gaze. "That was more than luck, Reeves. No clockmaker holds off 4 professional gunmen. Who are you really?" Before Solomon could formulate a response, Catherine Tillman pushed through the gathered men, her normally neat appearance disheveled from the hard ride. "Mr. Reeves," she called, dismounting awkwardly, clearly not an experienced rider. "Thank goodness you're alive. When we saw the flames from town, I feared the worst." She stopped short upon seeing his mechanical prosthesis, her eyes widening in surprise. That's not your usual—" "Miss Tillman," Solomon acknowledged with a nod, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "You shouldn't have come, it's not safe." "Clearly," she replied, gesturing to the burning cabin. Her eyes moved to his left shoulder, where blood darkened his shirt, where Thorn's bullet had grazed him. "You're wounded." "It's nothing," Solomon insisted, though in truth the adrenaline was beginning to fade, making the injury more noticeable. "Sheriff Voss and his men fled west. Thorn went north through the cottonwoods. If you hurry, you might catch one group." "Thorn?" Taylor's expression darkened. "Lucas Thorn was here?" "Morris's specialist," Solomon confirmed. He won't stray. You far. He still has a contract to fulfill. Taylor gestured to his deputy and several of the townsmen. Hayes, take 4 men and head west after Voss. The rest of you search the Cottonwood Grove. I doubt you'll find Thorn, but look anyway. As the men dispersed to follow orders, Taylor turned back to Solomon, his expression grave. You and I need to have a long overdue conversation, Reeves, or whatever your real name is. Solomon met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Yes, I suppose we do. As they stood in the flickering light of the burning cabin, Solomon's home and livelihood reduced to embers, he knew that one chapter of his life had ended. The peaceful existence he had constructed so carefully was gone, consumed by flames and gunsmoke. The question now was, what would rise from those ashes? Solomon Reeves, the clockmaker with a mysterious past, or Solomon Timekeeper Reyes, the manhunter whose legend had pursued him despite his best efforts to escape it. And as Catherine Tillman moved to his side, her presence a reminder of connections he had tried so hard to avoid forming, Solomon realized that the choice might not be entirely his to make. The sheriff's office in Meridian Gulch was silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock, an ironclad standard model that Solomon had regulated to precision 2 years earlier. The steady rhythm, once comforting to his craftsman's ear, now seemed to mark the inexorable countdown to decisions that could not be postponed. Dawn had broken an hour ago, casting pale light through the office windows. Solomon sat across from Sheriff Taylor, his mechanical prosthesis now concealed beneath a leather glove. The wound on his shoulder had been cleaned and bandaged by Doc Wallace, who had asked no questions beyond those necessary for treatment. A professional courtesy. Solomon appreciated Catherine Tillman sat nearby, her presence unexpected, but apparently non-negotiable. When Taylor had suggested she return home after the confrontation at the cabin, she had fixed the sheriff with a look that brooked no argument. I've been intercepting telegrams about Mr. Reeves for weeks, she had stated flatly. I'm already involved. Now, as Taylor placed 3 mugs of coffee on his desk, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Start at the beginning, Taylor said, settling into his chair with the patience of a man who had conducted countless interrogations. And don't insult either of us by maintaining this clockmaker fiction any longer. Solomon wrapped his left hand around the coffee mug, welcoming its warmth. The night had left him chilled in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. The beginning, he echoed, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. Which beginning would that be, Sheriff? When I lost my hand? When I pinned on a marshal's badge? Or when I buried both those lives to become Solomon Reeves? How about the truth of who you really are? Taylor countered. Solomon studied the sheriff's weathered face, seeing no judgment there, only determination to understand the situation that had erupted in his jurisdiction. My real name is Solomon Reyes, he began, the admission itself a relief after years of careful concealment. I served as a deputy U.S. Marshal in the Dakota Territory from 1869 to 1878. Specialized in manhunts, tracking fugitives others couldn't find. Catherine's intake of breath drew his attention. The timekeeper, she said softly, recognition dawning in her eyes. I grew up reading penny dreadfuls about your captures. The one-handed lawman who could shoot a playing card in half at 30 paces. A hint of a smile touched Solomon's lips. Exaggerated like most such tales, though not entirely fictional. And the hand? Taylor asked, gesturing to Solomon's prosthesis. Lost it during the war. Confederate artillery at Chancellorsville. I was a sharpshooter in the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, Berdan's unit. Solomon's gaze grew distant with the memory. Adapted to shooting left-handed during recovery. Became more accurate than I'd been before the injury. Taylor nodded, processing this information. That explains your skill with a gun. What it doesn't explain is why a decorated lawman ended up hiding in Meridian Gulch making clocks. Solomon's expression hardened. I wasn't hiding. I was starting over. There's a difference? Taylor asked skeptically. A significant one. Solomon set down his mug with deliberate care. A man who's hiding is running from something. A man who's starting over is trying to build something new. And which were you doing 6 years ago when you arrived here? Catherine asked, her insight cutting to the heart of the matter. Solomon met her gaze directly. Both. The admission hung in the air between them. After a moment, Solomon continued, each word measured as precisely as the gears in his timepieces. In 1878, I was assigned to apprehend a gang led by a man named Samuel Garner. They'd robbed 3 banks across the territory, killed 2 tellers and a guard. I tracked them to a hunting lodge outside Bismarck. Solomon's mechanical fingers flexed unconsciously as he spoke, the memory vivid even after all these years. What I didn't know was that they had a hostage, Clara Whitfield, the 19-year-old daughter of the Bismarck bank president. They threatened to kill her if anyone approached. The Bismarck hostage crisis, Catherine said, recognition in her voice. The newspapers covered it for weeks. Solomon nodded grimly. Garner demanded a fortune in gold and safe passage to Canada. The territorial governor authorized me to negotiate, but with explicit orders not to let Garner escape, regardless of circumstances. An impossible position, Taylor observed quietly. I thought I could resolve it without bloodshed. Solomon continued. Arranged a prisoner exchange. The girl for free passage to the border. I would follow later, apprehend them once she was safe. He paused, the weight of what came next momentarily stealing his voice. What happened? Catherine prompted gently. The exchange was proceeding as planned. Clara was walking toward me, Garner, and his men mounting up with their gold. Then a shot rang out from the tree line. Solomon's face tightened with the memory. One of Garner's men fell dead. The territorial governor had positioned army sharpshooters without informing me. Violated the terms of surrender I'd negotiated. And Garner? Taylor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He grabbed Clara, used her as a shield. More shots were fired in the chaos. Solomon's voice faltered for the first time. She died in the crossfire. To this day, I don't know if it was an army bullet or one from Garner's gang that killed her. The official report blamed you, Catherine said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Solomon's bitter laugh held no humor. The army claimed I exceeded my authority in arranging the exchange. The governor denied authorizing the sharpshooters. Someone had to bear responsibility for a banker's daughter dying. The one-handed marshal with the controversial reputation was the convenient scapegoat. Taylor studied him through narrowed eyes. So you resigned your badge and disappeared. I did more than resign, Solomon corrected. I walked away from everything. My name, my reputation, my entire life. Clara Whitfield deserved justice, but there was none to be had through official channels. The powerful protected themselves, as they always do. And Lucas Thorne? Taylor asked. How does he fit into this history? Solomon's expression darkened. Before the Garner case, I was tracking Thorne across the territory. He'd already killed 8 men that we knew of, mostly contracted assassinations disguised as accidents or robberies gone wrong. I came closer to apprehending him than anyone had before, close enough that he remembered me, even after all these years. So when Morris hired Thorne to eliminate the troublesome clockmaker standing in the way of his water rights, Catherine began, Thorne discovered he'd been contracted to kill the one lawman who'd nearly caught him, Solomon finished. A professional challenge he couldn't resist. Taylor leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking beneath his weight. That brings us to the present problem. Morris has escalated from intimidation to attempted murder. Voss and his men have fled, but Thorne is still out there, with a contract to fulfill, and now a professional grudge to settle. And my home and livelihood are ashes, Solomon added, a hard edge entering his voice. Everything I built over 6 years, destroyed in a single night. Catherine leaned forward, her expression earnest. But you're alive, Mr. Reeves, or Reyes. That's what matters. Solomon turned to her with a penetrating gaze. And why exactly do you care, Miss Tillman? You've inserted yourself into a dangerous situation that doesn't concern you. Rather than retreat from his challenge, Catherine straightened her spine. You've been in Meridian Gulch 6 years, Mr. Reyes. Did it ever occur to you that during that time you might have become part of this community, whether you intended to or not? The question struck with unexpected force. Solomon had deliberately kept people at arm's length, avoiding entanglements or friendships that might complicate his carefully constructed new life. Yet here was this woman, this surprisingly determined telegraph operator, who had risked her position and possibly her safety to warn him of danger. Morris won't stop, Taylor said, breaking the charged silence. He's invested too much in this operation to simply walk away, and Thorne never leaves a contract unfulfilled, Solomon finished. It's a matter of professional pride for him. Then what's your plan? Taylor asked bluntly. Because I won't have a war in my jurisdiction, former marshal or not. Solomon considered his options, weighing them with the same precision he applied to the delicate mechanics of his chronometers. Morris is the source of this problem. Remove him, and Thorne loses his employer and his motivation. Remove him how? Taylor's voice sharpened with suspicion. If you're suggesting, I'm suggesting we expose him, Solomon interrupted. Morris has connections, influence, but he's not untouchable. If his involvement with Voss and Thorne became public knowledge, even his allies would distance themselves. Catherine sat forward eagerly. The telegrams. I've been keeping copies of all communications between Morris and his contacts in Helena. They don't explicitly mention violence, but they clearly show he's hiring men with questionable backgrounds to resolve property disputes. Taylor frowned. That's circumstantial at best. Morris would claim he hired security, had no knowledge of their methods. It's a starting point, Solomon countered, and I suspect Morris keeps more detailed records of his operations. A man controlling that much territory doesn't trust his memory alone. Taylor's expression remained skeptical. So you propose what? Breaking into Morris's ranch to search for incriminating documents? Nothing so dramatic. Solomon's lips curved in a slight smile. Morris comes to town every Sunday for dinner at the Silver Palace restaurant. His ranch manager, Elkins, handles the payroll at the Cattleman's Bank while Morris dines. I propose a quiet conversation with Mr. Elkins. You think Elkins will simply hand over evidence against his employer? Taylor asked incredulously. I think Elkins has been embezzling from Morris for at least 2 years, Solomon replied calmly. His new house in town, the expensive clothes for his wife, the thoroughbred horses, all beyond the means of a ranch manager's salary. Catherine's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Observation, timing, patterns. Solomon tapped his temple. The skills that made me an effective marshal didn't disappear when I changed professions. Elkins always visits the bank when Morris is occupied elsewhere. He always leaves with his saddlebags fuller than when he arrived, and he always makes his deposits at the Territorial Bank in Helena rather than the local branch. Taylor whistled softly. You've been watching all this time, haven't you? Even while pretending to be nothing more than a clockmaker. Old habits. Solomon acknowledged with a shrug that pulled at his wounded shoulder. Hard to suppress training that kept me alive for years. So you offer Elkins a choice. Provide evidence against Morris or face exposure as a thief, Catherine summarized, her quick mind following Solomon's strategy. Essentially, yes. Taylor drummed his fingers on the desk, considering. I can't officially sanction this approach, but I can look the other way for 24 hours, provided no laws are broken in the process. Solomon nodded. Fair enough. That still leaves the problem of Thorn, Catherine pointed out. Even if you undermine Morris, Thorn will still consider the contract valid. Thorn is a separate issue, Solomon agreed. One I'll handle personally. Not in my jurisdiction, Taylor said firmly. I won't have blood in my streets, no matter how justified. Solomon met the sheriff's gaze steadily. With respect, Sheriff, I don't think either of us gets to dictate terms to Lucas Thorn. He'll choose the time and place of our next encounter. Before Taylor could respond, the office door burst open. Deputy Hayes stood in the doorway, his young face flushed with exertion. Sheriff, just got word from the telegraph office. Morris is coming to town with a dozen riders. They'll be here within the hour. Taylor rose immediately. Apparently Morris isn't waiting for Sunday dinner. Any sign of Voss or Thorn among them? Hayes shook his head. The message didn't say, but the station master at Western Junction reported they're all heavily armed. Solomon stood, his decision made. Morris is forcing the confrontation now. He knows his attempt failed, and he's coming to finish the job personally. This is still my jurisdiction, Taylor insisted, though with less conviction than before. Morris wouldn't dare start a shooting war in the middle of town. Wouldn't he? Solomon countered. He's already escalated to hiring an assassin. A man who takes that step isn't concerned with legal niceties. Catherine rose as well, smoothing her skirt with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. What can I do to help? Stay out of this, Solomon and Taylor said simultaneously. She fixed them both with a level stare. I'm the only one with copies of the telegrams between Morris and his contacts in Helena. If you want evidence of his conspiracy, you need me. Solomon recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression she'd worn when confronting Taylor at the cabin. This woman, he realized, possessed a backbone of steel beneath her proper exterior. The telegrams alone won't be enough, he said, softening his tone. We need Elkins. Catherine nodded decisively. Then I'll find Elkins while you deal with Morris. Sunday is payday. He'll be at the bank as usual, even with Morris in town. Taylor looked between them, clearly unhappy with the situation, but recognizing the necessity. I don't like civilians involving themselves in law enforcement matters. I'm hardly a civilian in this context, Sheriff, Solomon pointed out, and Miss Tillman has already involved herself quite thoroughly. Taylor sighed heavily, the sound of a man recognizing when he's outnumbered. Hayes, get word to our deputies and any trustworthy men in town. Tell them to be ready but not to assemble openly. I don't want to provoke Morris if there's any chance of resolving this peacefully. As Hayes hurried to follow orders, Taylor turned back to Solomon. You're sure Thorn is still out there? Absolutely, Solomon confirmed. He'll be watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity. A public confrontation with Morris would provide excellent cover for him to complete his contract. Taylor checked his revolver with the practiced movements of a veteran lawman. Then we'd best deny him that opportunity. I want you out of sight until Morris states his business. If he's come for legitimate reasons, we avoid unnecessary conflict. And if he hasn't? Catherine asked quietly. Solomon answered before Taylor could. Then Meridian Gulch learns why they call me the timekeeper. An hour later, Solomon watched from the shadowed interior of the gunsmith's shop as Randall Morris and his entourage rode slowly down Main Street. Morris cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his 60 years, silver hair gleaming beneath a black Stetson that probably cost more than most men in town earned in a month. He rode at the center of his group, flanked by hard-faced men whose eyes constantly scanned the surroundings with professional wariness. No sign of Voss or his remaining men among them, Solomon noted, and certainly no sign of Lucas Thorn. The assassin would never ride openly with his employer. But Thorn was out there somewhere watching. Solomon's instincts, honed by years of hunting men like him, were certain of it. From his vantage point, Solomon could see Sheriff Taylor standing alone in the street, awaiting Morris's approach. The townspeople had sensed the tension and cleared. The boardwalks, peering from doorways and windows at the spectacle unfolding before them. Morris reined his horse to a stop directly in front of Taylor, looking down at the sheriff with the arrogance of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "Sheriff Taylor," Morris greeted him, voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "I understand there was some trouble at the Cottonwood Spring property last night." "That's putting it mildly," Taylor replied evenly. "Armed men attacked Solomon. Reeves at his home burned his cabin to the ground." Morris affected a concerned expression. "Terrible business. Outlaws, was it?" "Hired guns," Taylor corrected. "Working for someone with interest in Reeves's water rights." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople. Morris's smile remained fixed, though his eyes hardened. "A serious accusation, Sheriff. I assume you have evidence to support it." "Working on that," Taylor replied coolly. "Meanwhile, perhaps you can explain why you've ridden into my town with enough armed men to start a small war." Morris gestured expansively. "Protection, Sheriff. These are dangerous times. Just yesterday, one of my foremen was accosted by a vagabond demanding money. Can't be too careful." "And your business in Meridian Gulch today?" Taylor pressed. "Banking matters," Morris answered smoothly. "Followed by a proposition I'd like to present to your town council. The railroad is considering a spur line through this region. As a man of influence with the Northern Pacific, I've been advocating for Meridian Gulch to be included on that route." Another murmur ran through the watching crowd, this one more excited. A railroad connection could transform the small town's fortunes overnight. "Of course," Morris continued, his voice taking on a regretful tone. "There are competing considerations. The surveyors need reliable water sources along the route, which makes properties like Cottonwood Spring particularly valuable. I've made generous offers to Mr. Reeves, but he seems unreceptive." Solomon could almost admire Morris's performance, offering the town prosperity with one hand while subtly threatening it with the other. A masterful manipulation that presented Reeves as the obstacle to progress rather than a victim of intimidation. "Speaking of Mr. Reeves," Morris said, scanning the onlookers, "I'd like to speak with him directly. Man to man, perhaps we can resolve our differences amicably." "Reeves's home was burned to the ground last night," Taylor replied tersely. "He's not receiving visitors." Morris's smile never wavered. "A temporary setback, I'm sure. I'd be happy to contribute to rebuilding efforts as a gesture of community goodwill." The calculation was clear. Morris was performing for the townspeople now, positioning himself as the reasonable benefactor while isolating Solomon as the impediment to progress. If public opinion turned against the clockmaker, Morris wouldn't need Thorne to eliminate him. The community itself would pressure Solomon to sell. Solomon watched Catherine Tillman slip away from the crowd, moving purposefully toward the bank. Good. Their plan was proceeding regardless of Morris's theatrical arrival. What troubled Solomon more was the absence of Lucas Thorne. The specialist would be positioned somewhere with a clear view of the proceedings, likely with a rifle rather than his preferred derringer, given the distance involved. Every instinct honed from years of manhunting told Solomon that he was being watched, measured, assessed. The confrontation between Morris and Taylor continued, with Morris becoming increasingly condescending as he outlined his vision for Meridian Gulch's future, a future that conveniently required control of Solomon's water rights. Solomon studied the surrounding buildings, mentally eliminating locations, until his attention fixed on the steeple of the small church at the end of the street. It offered the perfect vantage point, elevation, clear sightlines, and multiple escape routes. If he were positioning a sharpshooter, that's exactly where he'd place him. As if confirming his suspicion, a brief glint of light, sunlight reflecting, Off glass winked from the steeple window. In that moment, Solomon made his decision. Morris was putting on a show for the townspeople, trying to win them to his side. Thorne was waiting for the perfect opportunity to fulfill his contract. Time to change the dynamics of both situations simultaneously. Solomon stepped out of the gunsmith shop onto the boardwalk, his appearance causing an immediate ripple of reaction through the crowd. Morris turned in his saddle, eyes widening slightly at the sight of the man he'd tried to have killed standing calmly before him. "Mr. Morris," Solomon called, his voice carrying clearly down the street. "I believe you wanted to speak with me about my property." A hush fell over Meridian Gulch's main street. The steady rhythm of the wind blowing dust across the wooden boardwalks was the only sound as Solomon Reyes stood facing Randall Morris. For a breathless moment, the tableau held. The one-handed clockmaker on the boardwalk, the powerful rancher atop his gleaming black stallion, surrounded by his hired guns. Morris recovered quickly from his surprise, his weathered face arranging itself into a mask of cordial concern. "Mr. Reeves," he called, "I was just expressing my sympathies to Sheriff Taylor about the unfortunate incident at your property. Terrible business, truly." "Spare me the performance," Solomon replied, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "We both know who sent Voss and his men to my cabin, who hired Lucas Thorne when intimidation failed." A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Morris's smile tightened, though he maintained his composure. "Serious accusations, Mr. Reeves. Slanderous. In fact, unless you have evidence to support them." Solomon stepped off the boardwalk into the street, moving with deliberate calm. His gloved mechanical hand hung relaxed at his side, his left hand visible and empty. To the onlookers, he appeared unarmed and vulnerable before Morris's armed entourage. "Interesting that you're so concerned with evidence," Solomon observed, continuing his steady approach. "When your men burned my home, they destroyed most of what I owned, including my workshop ledgers showing the 7 previous offers you've made for my property, each one delivered with increasingly transparent threats." Morris shifted in his saddle, a fleeting expression of unease crossing his face as Solomon drew closer. "Business negotiations can sometimes become heated. That hardly constitutes evidence of criminal activity." Solomon stopped 15 paces from Morris's horse, close enough for conversation, far enough to observe the entire group. From the corner of his eye, he noted Sheriff Taylor's position, hands hovering near his revolvers as he watched the confrontation. "Unfold. Let's dispense with the pretense, Morris," Solomon said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You didn't bring 12 armed men to town for a banking errand. You came because Voss failed to drive me off my land, and Thorne failed to eliminate me. Now you're here to finish the job personally, with enough witnesses to claim self-defense. When I end up dead in the street." Morris's affable mask slipped further, his eyes hardening to match the steel in Solomon's voice. "You overestimate your importance, clockmaker. I merely came to offer you one final opportunity to sell your property at a fair price before the railroad commissioners make their final routing decisions. Decisions that could leave Meridian Gulch a dying backwater if the spur line bypasses it. It was cleverly done, Solomon had to admit. Morris was playing to the crowd again, presenting himself as the town's benefactor while painting Solomon as the obstacle to progress. Several townspeople glanced at Solomon with obvious concern. The railroad connection was vital to their community's future. "The railroad," Solomon replied, raising his voice slightly to ensure the onlookers heard clearly. "Yes, let's discuss that. Strange how the Northern Pacific surveyors reported 3 viable routes through this territory, only, one of which requires my spring. Stranger still how those alternative surveys disappeared from the territorial offices shortly after you became an investor in the railroad." Morris's face flushed with anger. "You presume too much, Reeves." Do I? Or perhaps I've simply been more observant than you anticipated. Solomon took another step forward, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Did you know that Catherine Tillman, our telegraph operator, has been keeping copies of all communications between you and your associates in Helena, including coded messages about removing obstacles and handling the spring problem? Morris's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the telegraph office, then back to Solomon. Intercepting private communications is a federal offense. Miss Tillman could find herself in serious legal trouble. Perhaps, Solomon acknowledged, but I suspect she'd consider it worth the risk if it prevents murder. Just as your ranch manager, Mr. Elkins, might consider cooperation with the law, preferable to prison for embezzlement. At the mention of Elkins, Morris's composure cracked completely. What nonsense are you— At this moment, Solomon interrupted. Miss Tillman is presenting Sheriff Taylor's deputy with documentation of your conspiracy. Mr. Elkins is explaining how you've systematically used intimidation, arson, and occasionally murder to expand your holdings across 3 counties. And somewhere in this town, Lucas Thorne is watching through a rifle scope, waiting for the perfect moment to complete his contract on my life. Solomon's gaze moved deliberately toward the church steeple, possibly from that vantage point, though I suspect he's relocated since I spotted the reflection from his scope. Morris's men tensed at this revelation, several reaching instinctively for their weapons. Sheriff Taylor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising tension. That's enough. No one draws in my town unless I give the word. Morris leaned forward in his saddle, dropping all pretense of civility. This is absurd. You're asking these good people to believe the ravings of a clockmaker with a personal grudge against me over the word of a respected businessman who's brought prosperity to this territory. Not a clockmaker, came a new voice from the crowd. Solomon turned slightly to see Walter Johnson, the barkeep from the Frontier Saloon, step forward. The stocky bartender held a folded newspaper in his hand. Been meaning to show you this, Sheriff, Johnson said, unfolding the yellowed pages. Came across it when my brother visited from Bismarck last month. Thought our Mr. Reeves looked familiar, but couldn't place it until now. He held up the newspaper, a 6-year-old edition of the Bismarck Tribune. Even from a distance, the headline was legible. Famed Marshal resigns amid controversy. Timekeeper Reyes disappears after hostage tragedy. A shock of recognition spread through the gathered townspeople. Johnson pointed at Solomon. That ain't just some clockmaker facing down Morris and his men. That's Solomon Timekeeper Reyes, the one-handed marshal who brought down the Cassidy gang and tracked the Millbrook killer across 3 territories. Morris's face drained of color as he stared at Solomon with new understanding. Reyes? He whispered, the name clearly familiar even to him. Solomon inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. For 6 years, he had hidden his identity, built a new life and avoided confrontation. Now, in the space of a single day, the carefully constructed facade had been stripped away. Does it change your calculations, Morris? Solomon asked quietly. Knowing who you've actually been trying to kill. Before Morris could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the bank. Deputy Hayes was escorting Mark Elkins down the street at gunpoint, with Catherine Tillman following, her arms full of ledgers and documents. The ranch manager's face was ashen, his hands secured before him with manacles. Sheriff, Hayes called, got a confession and documentation. Morris has been orchestrating land grabs across the territory, using Voss and others to intimidate, burn out, even murder homesteaders who wouldn't sell. Morris's men looked to their employer with uncertainty, the balance of power visibly shifting. Morris himself seemed frozen in his saddle, calculations racing behind his eyes as his carefully constructed scheme collapsed around him. It's over, Morris, Sheriff Taylor said, stepping forward with his hand on his revolver. Dismount slowly and surrender yourself. For a tense moment, it seemed Morris might comply. Then his expression hardened with desperate resolve. "Shoot them!" he shouted to his men. "Shoot them all! $1,000 to the man who kills Reyes!" Before any of his hired guns could react, Solomon's left hand moved with blinding speed. The sudden motion drew all eyes, but instead of reaching for a weapon as expected, he simply tapped his vest pocket twice in rapid succession. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the air. Morris jerked in his saddle as the bullet struck him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him halfway around before he toppled from his horse. His men, caught off guard by the unexpected shot and unsure of its source, hesitated, a fatal error in a street confrontation. In that moment of confusion, Solomon made his move. His left hand swept aside his coat, drawing the Remington revolver from a concealed holster with a smoothness that seemed impossible for a one-handed man. His mechanical right hand stabilized his wrist as the revolver came level. "Drop your weapons," Solomon commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of his former profession. "Or the next shots won't be warnings." From the rooftops and windows surrounding the street, armed townspeople appeared. Shopkeepers, ranchers, ordinary citizens positioned by Sheriff Taylor's deputy, while Morris had been distracted by Solomon's confrontation. The hired guns found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned, caught in a crossfire of their employer's making. One by one, they raised their hands in surrender. As Taylor and his deputies moved to disarm Morris's men, Solomon's attention turned to the source of the rifle shot. The bullet that struck Morris had not come from any of the townspeople. It had come from the upper window of the hotel across the street. A figure appeared briefly in the window, not firing at Solomon as expected, but signaling with a deliberate movement of the rifle barrel. The message was clear to someone of Solomon's experience: the contract is void. Lucas Thorne, it seemed, had his own code. With Morris exposed and incapacitated, the assassin considered their business concluded. The shot that wounded Morris had served multiple purposes, demonstrating Thorne's skill, nullifying the contract by eliminating his employer's ability to pay, and perhaps most surprisingly, preventing a bloody street battle that might have claimed innocent lives. Solomon gave a nearly imperceptible nod of acknowledgement toward the window, though Thorne had already vanished from view. Their unfinished business would remain so, at least for now. Marshal Reyes, Sheriff Taylor called, deliberately using Solomon's true name and former title. "Need your assistance with the prisoner." Solomon holstered his revolver and moved to where Morris lay, clutching his bleeding shoulder, surrounded by deputies. The rancher's face was contorted with pain and fury as he glared up at the man he'd tried to have killed. "You're finished in this territory, Morris," Taylor informed him, securing the rancher's wrists with manacles despite his wound. "Conspiracy, attempted murder, land fraud, enough charges to keep you in territorial prison for the remainder of your natural life." Morris spat toward Solomon's boots. "This isn't over, Reyes. I have friends in the capital, connections you can't imagine." "Had," Solomon corrected calmly. "Past tense. Men like you are embraced by the powerful only while you're useful. Once you're exposed, those same connections will distance themselves faster than you can imagine." As the deputies led Morris away, Catherine approached Solomon, clutching the documents that had provided the final evidence needed to bring down the rancher. "You knew," she said, studying him with those perceptive eyes that had first recognized there was more to him than a simple clockmaker. "You knew Thorne would be watching, that he'd intervene when Morris gave the order to shoot." Solomon shook his head slightly. "I didn't know. I suspected, hoped perhaps, that Thorne's professional pride would lead him to abort a contract that had become compromised. He's a killer, but one with a twisted code of ethics." "You signaled him," Catherine pressed. "I saw you tap your vest." A ghost of a smile touched Solomon's lips. "Old arrangement between manhunters and our quarry. Sometimes a clean arrest is preferable to bloodshed." Thorn and I have been circling each other for years, each recognizing something of ourselves in the other. Catherine's expression suggested she found this explanation less than satisfying, but before she could question him further, they were surrounded by townspeople, neighbors who had known Solomon Reeves for 6 years, suddenly discovering they had been living alongside the legendary timekeeper. Questions came from all directions. Was it true he could hit a playing card at 30 paces? Had he really tracked the Millbrook killer for 40 days across 3 territories? Were the stories about his quick-draw abilities exaggerated? Solomon fielded their inquiries with patient discomfort, neither confirming nor denying the more outlandish tales that had grown around his former identity. Throughout, he remained acutely aware of Thorn's likely continued presence somewhere in town, watching the aftermath of their indirect confrontation. As the excitement gradually subsided and people dispersed to spread the news of Morris's downfall and the clockmaker's true identity, Sheriff Taylor approached Solomon once more. "Thorn's gone," he said quietly. "My men searched the hotel, found a rifle position but no shooter. He's a ghost." "He always was," Solomon replied. "That's what made him so dangerous." Taylor studied him with newfound respect. "You played a dangerous game today, Reyes. Morris could have ordered his men to open fire immediately. Thorn could have decided to complete his contract regardless of circumstances. Calculated risks," Solomon acknowledged, "but risks nonetheless." The sheriff glanced toward where Catherine stood speaking with Deputy Hayes, still clutching the incriminating documents. "What now? Your secret's out. The quiet life you built here is gone," Solomon finished, following Taylor's gaze to Catherine. "Though perhaps that's not entirely a tragedy." Taylor nodded with understanding. "Town needs a deputy, you know. Hayes is good, but green. Could use someone with experience." The offer hung in the air between them. Not just employment, but legitimacy. A chance to reclaim a portion of his former identity without abandoning the new life he'd built in Meridian Gulch. "I'll consider it," Solomon said after a moment, "but first I have a cabin to rebuild." "You won't lack for help with that," Taylor assured him, gesturing to where several townspeople were already discussing plans to assist with reconstruction. "Seems you've made more friends here than you realized, timekeeper." As the sheriff moved away to coordinate the transfer of prisoners, Catherine approached once more, her expression determined, despite the exhaustion evident in her face. "Your shop," she said without preamble. "The building has storage rooms above it that could serve as living quarters until your cabin is rebuilt. They're dusty, but serviceable." Solomon raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me lodging, Miss Tillman?" "I'm offering a practical solution to immediate circumstances," she replied briskly, though a hint of color touched her cheeks. "Unless you prefer the hotel." "The hotel would be more convenient," Solomon observed. "The hotel is also where Lucas Thorn was last seen," Catherine countered. "While I understand you two have some sort of professional understanding, I'd sleep better knowing you weren't under the same roof." Solomon couldn't entirely suppress a smile at her concern. "A valid consideration. I accept your offer, Miss Tillman, thank you." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. And since we're making arrangements, I should inform you that I've taken the liberty of retrieving the strongbox you mentioned was buried beneath your cabin's floorboards. Deputy Hayes and I recovered it this morning while you were meeting with the sheriff." Solomon stared at her in genuine surprise. Few people could catch the timekeeper off guard, yet this telegraph operator had managed it repeatedly in the span of a single day. "That box contains personal items I'd rather not lose," he said carefully. "How did you know where to find it?" "You mentioned the strongbox to Sheriff Taylor last night," she explained. "As for its location, you check your pocket watch precisely 3 times whenever you exit your cabin. Your gaze always falls to the same spot on the floor before you leave. Elementary observation, Mr. Reyes." For the first time in years, Solomon found himself laughing. a genuine unguarded sound that drew startled glances from nearby townspeople who had never heard more than a chuckle from the reserved clockmaker. "Miss Tillman," he said, when he'd recovered, "I believe I've underestimated you rather severely." "Most men do," she replied, with the faintest hint of satisfaction. An oversight that has proven advantageous on numerous occasions. Their conversation was interrupted by young Jamie from the livery stable, who came running up with wide eyes fixed on Solomon. "Mr. Reyes." "Mr. Reyes," the boy called excitedly, no longer using the familiar Mr. Reeves now that he knew the clockmaker's true identity. "Is it true what they're saying? That you were the famous timekeeper, that you could outdraw any man with just your left hand?" Solomon's expression softened as he regarded the enthusiastic youth. "Some of what they say is true, Jamie. Much is exaggerated. The important truth is that I'm still the same man who repaired your mother's music box last month. But you can shoot, right?" Jamie pressed. "Like, really shoot? Could you teach me?" Before Solomon could respond, Catherine interjected smoothly, "I'm certain Mr. Reyes would be happy to teach you proper firearm safety and responsibility at some point, with your mother's permission, of course." Jamie's face lit up, even as Solomon gave Catherine a questioning look. She returned it with innocent composure. "Run along now, Jamie," she continued. "I believe your employer needs help with the horses Morris's men left behind." As the boy dashed off, Solomon turned fully to Catherine. "You seem to be making rather extensive arrangements for my future, Miss Tillman." "Someone should," she replied. "Candidly, you've spent 6 years hiding from who you truly are, Mr. Reyes. Perhaps it's time to consider an alternative approach to your remaining years." "And what approach would that be?" Catherine met his gaze directly, her characteristic forthrightness undiminished by the day's events. "Integration rather than separation. The qualities that made you an exceptional lawman didn't disappear when you became a clockmaker. Your precision, your attention to detail, your protective instincts, they were merely redirected." Solomon considered her words, finding unexpected wisdom in them. For 6 years, he had tried to bury Solomon Timekeeper, Reyes beneath the identity of Solomon Reeves, treating his past and present as irreconcilable opposites that could not coexist. "The town knows who you are now," Catherine continued when he remained silent. "You can either run again, establishing a new identity somewhere else, or you can remain Solomon Reyes, former marshal, current clockmaker, and perhaps future deputy. A complete person, rather than a fragmented one." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting Meridian Gulch in hues of gold and amber, Solomon realized he stood at a crossroads as significant as the one he'd faced 6 years earlier after the Bismarck tragedy. Then he had chosen to run from his past and his identity. Now he was being offered a chance to reclaim both without abandoning what he had built in the years since. "Integration rather than separation," he repeated thoughtfully, watching as the townspeople, his neighbors, perhaps even his friends, went about securing the prisoners and restoring order to their community. "An interesting proposition, Miss Tillman." "Catherine," she corrected gently. "Under the circumstances, I believe we've earned the right to some informality." Solomon nodded, surprising himself with how natural it felt. "Catherine, then. And I suppose you should call me Solomon." "Solomon," she affirmed, testing the name as one might test the weight of an unfamiliar tool. "It suits you better than Mr. Reeves ever did." As they walked together toward his shop, or perhaps their shop, given how thoroughly Catherine had inserted herself into his affairs, Solomon was struck by the realization that his prosthetic hand no longer felt like a mark of shame or vulnerability. The events of the past 24 hours had transformed it into simply another facet of who he was, a physical representation of the integration Catherine had proposed. The timekeeper and the clockmaker, the manhunter and the craftsman, the solitary figure and the community member. Perhaps these weren't contradictions to be resolved, but complementary elements of a more complete identity than either could provide alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The formal charges against Morris, the reconstruction of his cabin, the decision about Taylor's deputy position, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, Lucas Thorne continued his deadly work. The confrontation postponed today would likely resurface in the future, as unfinished business between men like them inevitably did. But for now, as the final golden light of day washed over Meridian Gulch, Solomon Reyes walked toward a future that for the first time in 6 years he didn't feel compelled to face alone. The outlaws who had mocked the one-handed clockmaker had indeed made 2 fatal mistakes. They had underestimated Solomon Reyes based on his disability, never recognizing the deadly skill still present in his left hand. And they had believed that crafting intricate timepieces was all he had ever known, never suspecting the legendary manhunter concealed beneath the clockmaker's careful precision. Their mistakes had cost them everything, but in forcing Solomon to reclaim the identity he had abandoned, they had inadvertently given him something precious in return, the opportunity to become whole again, neither defined solely by his past nor limited by his present, but embracing both as integral parts of the man he truly was. The timekeeper had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.